So, damn it, I thought we could convert one more person to auditing. How many people do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That number is declining slowly each week. At the rate we're going, it might just be me sitting here by the time we get to week 12. And then I'm pretty sure, but because it's the summary week, everybody will come back. This week, we're going to look at testing internal controls. I didn't prepare this slide. A colleague of mine did, based on his last sabbatical where he went to an American institution, and he talked about control being controlling the game, I suppose, and testing that. So one team is trying to stop the other team from moving forward. I really don't know a lot about American football besides what I've seen on the news about Jared Hayne, to be honest. American baseball, I could tell you a lot about. American football, not my thing. So, let's draw our context diagram. And the beginning stuff, you've already seen a lot of. I'm just going to try and make the font smaller so that I can fit it all in. And you'll notice that I sort of start these with the same things all the time. And, we don't use anything terribly new. And each week I'm adding things to our puzzle. And we're expanding on that. We'll have to see if I can fit this all in. So let's put what we already know up here. Inherent risk. Oops, I want another text bubble. Control risk. We also know about materiality. And we know about our assertions. Okay, so I'm just going to draw some little lines to connect everything. Okay, so we know that the output is our audit report. I know that I need to collect audit evidence to go into that report. Materiality affects what items that I think I'm going to adjust. I collect my evidence based on my assertions, so my 5 and 4 assertions. My audit program helps me, hey, 13 people. All right, and my audit program helps me decide what audit evidence to collect. And that program is based on my audit strategy, which is driven by my audit risk model, where I use control risk and inherent risk to determine my level of detection risk. I also know that in my evidence, I need to engage in sampling because I can't test everything, and my sampling will be affected by the materiality and the audit strategy that I have. Now, in terms of strategies, I've got 2 types. I'm going to do these in a slightly different color. I've got my substantive approach. All right. Actually, I might just do it in here. And I've got my controls approach, which in textbooks is often called the lower assessed level of control risk approach. And if you see that in the book, nobody ever says lower of assessed control risk approach to doing the audit. They just say I'm taking the substantive approach or I'm taking the controls approach. And depending on how good my internal control pyramid is here and all those components will affect what sort of strategy I'm taking here, okay? And so what we're focusing on today is we are going to focus on doing this part here. Gathering audit evidence by testing the internal controls, all right? And remember here, we have a number of different components. We've got our control environment. Oh, well, can I shrink this small enough to actually fit it in there? Yes. All right, control environment, risk assessment process. And then we've got our control activities, which I'm just going to list as controls. All right. And then I'm just going to put M for monitoring because there's no room to fit the M. Monitoring. And then we also have information systems that collect all the data that we use in our decision-making process. Okay, so the reason that I put those two as green is because when I'm doing my controls approach, I'm actually looking at testing the monitoring and control activities in the firm. All right, and what I'm looking for or what I'm gathering evidence on is, do the controls operate or execute as they are designed? Okay, and that's the big question. If they do, that's great. We can do less substantive testing, but if they don't, then I need to figure out what to do next with my audit strategy, and we need to adjust our audit risk model as a result of that. So you'll notice that this diagram is a lot more full than the previous ones that we've done. And it will continue to grow in size. So today we're going to look at how we test those internal controls, identifying what those controls are to gather audit evidence. All right? And we're going to use the same things that we already know about. So we already know about our audit procedures. All right? I've got my procedures of vouching, tracing, inspecting, doing recalculations, talking to people. I need to use those same procedures to collect my evidence as well. Does that sound okay? Are you surprised that we've made it this far? And this is everything that you know, and there's still more to go. All right, I'll do a little save here. All right, so what are we going to do today? We're going to cover a few different things. Probably we're looking at different types of controls, computer and manual controls. We're going to look at the techniques for testing. We're going to look at designing tests of controls, looking at the results, and then documentation. Now, in terms of things that I think are most important for today, and Nelson and I just worked on sort of fleshing out or drafting the outline of our final exam, this one is really critical, the design part. And the reason why is I'm going to add a little diagram here in from an education conference that I went to recently that talks about, it's not very clear, but it talks about the types of skills that we want students to have. All right? And so when you're learning something for the first time, basic skills about understanding and remembering. All right, so that's the knowledge test. What is the definition of a blah? What is the definition of a blah? What does this mean? In auditing, we're a third-year subject, and what we're aiming to do is we are trying to assess you up at that level. Hey, 14th person. Yay. All right. So we are trying to assess you up here. Okay, and at the very pointy end is the idea of creating, about taking the information that we have learnt about, that we've learnt to apply, and then create using that. And so that's what we're going to do when we're designing tests of controls. We are creating audit procedures to gather evidence. Is anybody here very arty? Drawing, music? Nobody? So this is going to be a really big change. All right? And this is where there is a saying that audit is more like an art form than a science. All right? We think about science and its strict rules. This is like comparing CMS and MDC. Right? CMS has all these formulas and rules to follow. MDC is much more difficult in terms of its content because it's more difficult concepts and it's creation work. And so that's what third-year subjects are about. We're about that creating and evaluating work. And so that's what you guys are going to be working on. You guys are going to become designers. You're going to become artists from an audit perspective. Anyway, I'm not sure if anybody else is going to pay big money for any of your audit programs when you die as art, but it's going to be an important component of how we assess you in the final exam. We are going to focus on, doing these things here. All right, so evaluating, creating, analyzing, applying. All right, and we've already done lots of this applying and analyzing stuff. It's the creating stuff that's going to be a little bit new, and we're going to work on it. I'm going to do lots of examples, and there's going to be lots of chances for you to create and then to get feedback as well. I see some worried looking faces. Don't worry, it sounds a bit scary, but there'll be lots of hand holding. All right, so next week I'm going to talk about some very specific rules, design guidelines, I suppose, that we use for creating that'll really help push you along a little bit. All right, so companies have entity level controls, which we know of, or we understand probably most easily as our pyramid. All right, so we have our control environment, our whole organization affects our risk assessment, which affects our control activities, our monitoring, and our information systems. All right, so that's this diagram. That's simply the same components put into a circle, and it's a little loop. Here's what we're going to focus more on. All right, so we're going to focus more on transaction level controls. These tend to be more of the control activities. And this is what you were doing in your field studies. Okay, so when we went out and we did our field studies, I asked you to basically find for me transaction level controls. All right, and I've actually created some extra slides for today that are not on your versions but will be on the video, where I pick out some information from some of the field studies, and we're actually going to talk about analysing them in terms of what is the control, how would I gather information or evidence on whether this control is operating effectively or not, to give us some ideas. Okay, so it says there, controls can be any procedure used and relied upon to prevent errors from occurring or detecting them. And that's really important there, the idea of prevent or detect and correct, right? Obviously, the ideal is to stop an error from happening, but if an error does manage to slip by, I want to be able to find it before I make a big decision using the wrong information. All right, so we've got preventing and detecting as our types of errors. So our controls have two main objectives. We already talked about this, preventing and detecting, and then supporting automated parts of the business. So certainly with computerization we've got rapid miniaturization of technology. Who would have known that 20 years ago there would have been a computer that you wore on a watch that synced to all your other devices? But automation is a big part of moving forward, right? So in the old days, accountants were trained as bookkeepers, debits and credits. Can anyone tell me what the purpose of a trial balance is? Besides this thing you have to do in first year accounting. A trial balance is there to make sure that all the debits match all of the credits. Because remember, you do journal entries, then you post those journal entries to T accounts, then you sum up those T accounts to be a number in the trial balance. And if you do that for all of the accounts, all of the debits and all of the credits should match, all right? When your trial balance doesn't match, that means that a debit or a credit doesn't work somewhere, right? You've debited 500 and credited 50, for example. Now, all of that's automated, right? You can't go into MYOB and do debit 50, credit 500. It just won't let you. So there are lots of parts of businesses where we've used information technology and controls to prevent misstatements and then also automate the business, right? So what do we have at Woolworths that means that you can buy goods without even speaking to anybody? Self-service checkouts, all right? You can renew your registration for your car online, right? I remember going as a child, and every time car registration was up for renewal, you'd have to go to the RTA. I remember going with my mum, and you'd sit there and there'd be 1,000 people in there all trying to re-register their cars. And the very first time I found out you could do it online, amazing. All right, changes in technology. So there's lots of automated parts of the business from selecting inventory to ordering goods and services to buying things on eBay where you don't have any contact with any people, to enrollment systems for university, right? The first time I enrolled in university, back in 1997, when you guys were all still like running around at kindergarten, it was an entire day process of lining up in queues so you could talk to people, so that they could type in your information into a system from a form that you'd filled out about your address and what degree you wanted to do, right? What do you do when you need to enroll in new subjects for a new semester? You go online, right? I used to have to fill out a form with your top 10 preferences of subjects, even though you could only do 4. Preferences of times. We would wait in this queue and you would shuffle forward and then you would hand it to a person. That person would go to the one computer in the university, it seemed like at the time, try and enroll you, give you your next best options, then print out a dot matrix printout of the classes you were in and give it to you. But on that, there were no room allocations, right? You just got subject number, day, time, tutorial number, and then you would have to go to this really big notice board that hundreds of people would crowd around every day, trying to find the subject number, the tutorial number, and the time to look across in tiny 8-point print to find the room location that was printed on there, because they weren't all systems all together. So imagine if we did that now. We have 40,000 students on campus. 40,000 standing around notice boards looking at things. It was never anywhere near as fantastic and amazing and easy as it is now. So automation means that we engage in different ways with our businesses. Now we have 4 different types of controls. Manual, people doing stuff. Automated within applications. Controls surrounding general IT, and then combo controls that are IT and manual together. So you'll notice here that my detecting control is about detecting a control that has entered the system. This is the one we want here. All right, so the one that we're after, most of the ones we want to be preventative. Stop the error before it happens. All right. And then we have detecting, which is investigate and find the error after it occurs. Okay? So preventative is sort of like the speed camera, right? The speed camera is there to try and prevent people from speeding, and then it takes a photo that later allows the government to identify those people who have broken the law and then investigate and send them a nasty letter and a fine. Okay? Now you'll notice here that we've got manual controls, automated controls, and that the automated circle is bigger. And that's purely the rate of automation and the use of technology within business. Right? Even to get access to rooms within the university, you need a swipe card. All of our systems are computerized. Obviously, we know things go bad when UTS servers go down and there's no UTS online or there's no email. But there's a heavy reliance on automated controls. That poses its own risks. What does a company do when the power goes out? All right, when there's no internet. Oh, right. I have another little diagram that actually shows, our modern biggest worries. Number 1, no Wi-Fi. Number 2, no battery or power on your device. All right, that's the one thing I always do before I get on. At 3 o'clock. I know I leave for home at about 4:30. I always plug my phone into charge because there's nothing worse than being stuck on the train with a dead phone, right? Otherwise, I'd have to actually talk to strange people sitting next to me, right? Or sit there in silence looking out the window instead of, liking your posts on Facebook. So we have automated controls, and then we have in this Venn diagram some that are both, and I'm going to talk about both of those. All right. Now, if we're looking at testing a control, preventative controls can be applied to each transaction during normal processing. So that's really simple stuff. Barcode scanning of prices. When you're ordering something online, you can only order as much as they've got in stock. Or, online checking of credit card details stops you from putting in a fraudulent credit card or securing accounts. So, preventative controls are most of the time IT-based. So let's look at some examples. What if I want to make sure that sales are, what could go wrong is that sales could be not recoverable, which is the accounts receivable there. Let me just write that down. All right, so that's, I can't collect my accounts receivable. So let's have a computer program that checks whether they've exceeded credit limits, like the SWIFT system does within Cloud9. What if I might accidentally pay employees that are not real? That used to be a big scam. Create fake employees, put in fake timesheets for them, give them your bank account details, you get paid extra. So we could make sure that we have a valid tax file number, all right? Or you might want to make sure that we've got a valid photo ID. There's a, oops, oh, undo. Oh, I just want to move the text bit. Oh, well, I can't do it. There's an instance, and I was at a presentation by the Governance Support Unit, where they found, or they detected, somebody impersonating a student to sit an exam. All right. So apparently the enrolled student was female, and the impersonator was male, and had created a fake ID in the old days before our current IDs. But you know, I might want to check something that has a photo ID or a birth certificate or an original government document. What if I make sales at the incorrect value? I could have some sort of master price file, perhaps linked to maybe a barcode system, barcode scanning. And what about transactions doing the correct debit and credit over here? All right, I could use the computer to check that it's going to the right place. If I'm making sales, my debits can only be cash and accounts receivable. My credits can only be to revenue-related accounts, perhaps. So what about detecting controls? So in these ones, when we're detecting controls, what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify and correct errors that enter the records. So they've somehow snuck in, and they happen outside the normal flow, all right? So detective controls are often things that we would do on a weekly basis or a daily basis. At the end of the day, show me all discounts that might have been greater than 10% given by staff to maybe identify if something unusual is going wrong. So there could be a number of different issues around detecting controls. So first one, actually I'm going to skip down here to this one because this one's a good one. Errors in the number of units or unit prices being calculated or applied incorrectly. So at Cloud9 they ordered 50 and I only gave them 45. An idea of a control is that each day you might total up the number of goods ordered and the number of goods shipped out. Oh, well, we shipped out 900 units today. Oh, well, according to this, only 850 units were ordered. Who are the extra 50 units that we sent to somebody by accident? All right. A bank reconciliation is a, here we go, bank reconciliation's up here. A bank reconciliation is a detecting control. All right, where once a month, I check all of the bank statement and cash journal entries to make sure that they're correct. So generally, anything that is a reconciliation tends to be a detecting control, trying to make sure that everything matches up after the fact. When you guys sit exams, they actually count the number of papers compared to the number of exam attendance slips versus some other check that they do, and they reconcile that. And I, as a lecturer, when I receive the papers, I'm actually supposed to count them as well. Don't know anybody that does. Actually, no, James Wakefield does, who teaches Accounting A. He actually goes through and counts all 1,000 something papers to make sure that they're all there. I've never actually counted. I just assume that they're doing the right thing. I'm probably not enacting the detecting control very well there. All right. With detecting controls, what is important is that when we're trying to do a reconciliation, you've got to hope that your system captures all the data that you need. All right, because if the cash journal system goes down for a week, then you're not going to have complete and accurate data to be able to do your bank reconciliation. Detecting controls help us identify potential errors, but often will require a human to investigate, is this a big issue or not a big issue? But one of the keys is that they have to be performed on a consistent and regular basis. If you're only doing the bank reconciliation once every 2 years, it's not going to do you any good. You need to do it monthly. If you're checking at the end of the day, has anybody ever worked in a retail store and had to handle cash? What do you do at the end of the day with the cash register?
Cash reconciliation.
There's a cash reconciliation. So cash could have been stolen throughout the day, which you might not know about, and you'll detect it in that reconciliation where you take, usually you print out something from the cash register that says this is how much cash should be in there. You count the cash and then hopefully, fingers crossed, that amount is the same. If it's a little bit different by maybe 5 or 10 cents, they're probably not going to worry. If it's out by $50 or $100 or $150, then something's gone wrong. And it alerts them to an issue. What you also have to make sure that you do when we do have detective controls is that we follow up and correct them. Right? No point in somebody doing a bank reconciliation and then nobody ever checking whether it's been done correctly. All right. It's like highlighting people who could be involved in perhaps overstating their hours on the timesheets, but never having the manager investigate those staff members. So these detective controls are all part of the monitoring that we see at the top of the internal control pyramid just there. Shade that in. All right, so that's the monitoring component that's really, really important. Okay, I'm going to do a save. Okay, so what sort of examples are there of detective controls? We could have reviews, we could have lots of reconciliations, or exception reports. Exception reports are when the system tells you something isn't right. Okay, I don't want to know every time the ATM processes a card and PIN correctly. But what do I want to know? When the ATM choose a card because you might have tried to put your PIN in 3 times and it's failed. Okay, so that's the idea of an exception report. Now in the old days, before mobile phones and email, the bank used to chew up your card. At the end of the day, someone would open the ATM, get the cards out that had been detained. They'd go back to the bank teller, they'd use the card number to try and look up who the customer was, and they'd probably send you a letter. Dear customer, did you know that your card was retained by the ATM at 500 George Street on this particular day? Your PIN was incorrectly entered 3 times. Now, the bank still takes the card, but it'll probably send an alert to someone in a call center to contact you and say, hey, did you know, have you got your ATM card? Yes, I do. Oh, no, my wallet's been stolen. Ah, well, we know where it is because someone tried to use it to access an ATM at 500 George Street and they entered the PIN incorrectly 3 times and we now have the card. So the idea with the exception report is that when something goes wrong, somebody investigates. And again, that's part of the monitoring. I don't want to know it works every single time. I want to know when it stops working. All right. It's probably the same with, I'm heading to the airport on Friday week. We're heading on holidays. And I always get selected for that little drug test where they put the little piece of cloth on the wand and they run it over you to see if you come in contact with drug residue. I don't know what looks shifty about me or something, but I get selected every single time. Right? They probably screen thousands of people a day, and the system probably doesn't generate, the report it generates probably says, this many people scanned today, and then it probably only gives you the results of the people whose scans were a little bit iffy or came up with some sort of illegal residue detected. But nobody wants to read the reports of the 500 other people who were scanned and everything went fine. All right? So exception reports are really important. So what about manual and automated controls? This big lectern here that houses the computer system to stop anyone from stealing it, that's a manual control, right? The entire thing is bolted down and immovable, okay? Manual control. We could have IT controls as well, so let's go into IT controls. So we've got our automated controls. they rely on IT and IT infrastructure. So the IT general controls are generally controls around the infrastructure of the organisation. Who can access a computer? Who can access server data or sensitive data? Who can change a program? And then do we have things like backups? Okay. Anybody here watch the series Mr. Robot that's been on recently? Nobody? All right, so I'll give you a quick synopsis. So Mr. Robot, besides being about this guy who's schizophrenic and has a mental illness and he can't figure out what's real and what's not real, the whole idea is that it's about a group of hackers who decide that they're going to change the world by erasing the data of one of the world's biggest corporations that they call Evil Corp in the actual show. You know, the E sort of looks like it stands like the E from Enron, but they call it Evil Corp. And the company is into financing, so it owns like a large proportion of the world's debt. They sell goods, they manufacture things. They're, you know, a wide conglomerate. And they decide that they want to wipe out all the company's data. And they have an issue though, because even though there are there's computer servers that you could hack into, the company keeps backups of all of its data in this big mountain facility that is not connected to any network, right? So you can't hack in the traditional computer hacker at a keyboard sort of sense. So what they do is they hack the infrastructure, because this is all on magnetic tapes, not like DVDs or hard drives. It's all on magnetic tapes, old technology. And they discover that the old technology, when you heat the air to a certain temperature, makes the magnetic tape unstable. And then for the information that's stored on it, just gets wiped. All right? So the whole premise of the show is that the guy, over a number of series of episodes, manages to hack into the air conditioning system. So the computers that hold the information themselves are isolated off any network. But the air conditioning for the facility in which the information is stored are all networked from the head office. So once he hacks into one of those, he hacks into all the places where the data is stored, he turns up the heat, and then all the data disappears, essentially. So the whole purpose of that was talking about that we need to think about securing infrastructure. All right? What happened to UNSW on the weekend? Anybody know? Their Facebook page got hacked. We know that obviously there's the Ashley Madison scandal. There's been WikiLeaks and all the government documentation. There was the My Masters scandal where somebody blew the whistle there. But keeping a really strong lock on your technology is really, really important, because information is power. Information is the new commodity. All right? And there was another, so I watch a lot of TV. What show was it? I'm trying to remember what. There was another show where one part of a city received the internet slightly faster than another part. And if you're in that part of the city, you receive information 1 or 2 seconds before everybody else. And therefore you can trade financially on that information 1 or 2 seconds before everybody else, which gives you the opportunity to make more money. So infrastructure is really, really important. I want to know who can change programs. This is really crucial. If I'm a disgruntled bank worker and I want to pay off my mortgage really quickly, and I was a programmer, what stops me from stealing $1 out of everybody's account and then keeping it for myself? Controls over information systems and programs. And I'll draw you a little example here. All right. So computer systems are normally broken into, usually, 3 main systems. The first system is usually what is called dev or development. This is where programmers make changes to systems. The second one is usually where people test those changes to make sure that they're bug-free. They make sure that the system does what it's supposed to do. And then you have another system, which is where all your customers and your staff actually do their work. All right? So you've got development, testing, and production, and they're usually 3 separate systems. So if I'm a computer programmer, all all right, and I make a change here, to get that change into the test system so that somebody can test it, somebody has to move it over here, all right? So then I test, somebody different tests the change, and before it can go into live, somebody actually needs to move it from there to there. So what is really important within IT systems is having segregation of duties. Different people doing different jobs. To stop me, the disgruntled bank computer developer, from making a change here that will allow me to steal money over here. All right? So these people are all different people doing different jobs, and even the person that does the moving, that person's only job is usually just to do that. They can't code or access any of these systems. Their security setup only allows them to do one thing: move a piece of code from one place to somewhere else. That's how we have segregation of duties, to make sure that, you know, you as a student can't access certain things. So segregation is really important. And we can use a lot of application controls to make sure that we've got segregation of duties. That means different people have different levels of access. Okay? So when you go into my subject activities, you can see just you. When I go into my subject activities, I can see every subject taught within, I think, the business and law faculty. Right, we're under the same sort of little grouping of codes. I can see every subject, every student, so, because I need to print off class lists. All right? I can put in a student number and get your timetable, but what I can't do is I can't access your address, your phone number, because that's not something I need to do my job. All right? So different levels of access for different people. Students often say, Amanda, can you change my tutorial? My access within my subject activities is read-only because I don't need access to change things. However, student staff, or student centre staff, have access to change and edit and assist you with e-requests and all that sort of thing, because that's part of their role and responsibility. UTS Online, you can just see, I can enroll people in UTS Online, I can edit the folders. If you've ever posted a question anonymously on UTS Online, it's not really anonymous. So as the coordinator, I can actually, if there's a concern, I can actually apply to find out who the anonymous posters are. If you're saying something that's, you might be bullying another student, or you're using bad language, I could delete it, but I could also find out who that person is by requesting that you be de-anonymized. Just like student feedback surveys. If you make a threat in a student feedback survey, they will de-anonymize it and they will investigate, and charges against those students might be laid. So don't ever make a threat in your student feedback survey. Really, really bad idea. Don't swear in your student feedback survey because they bleep them out. There's actually a program that runs that replaces swear words with a little bracket that says inappropriate language removed. So just be creative. If you're going to insult me, be creative. All right, then we have IT-dependent manual controls, and these are controls that have both. So there might be an automated component like a variance report and then a follow-up. So I got one of these the other day. The system automatically ran a report that showed me students in my subject that were listed as withheld. That was automatically emailed to me, and I had to investigate and submit some paperwork as a result. So I have to make sure I investigate, is the report coming out regularly, and then also, this is the crucial bit, is somebody actually following it up? All right, because if nobody's following it up and it just sits in a drawer somewhere, or it goes into an email automatic folder that no one ever looks at, then the control really isn't working correctly. So what techniques do we use when we're testing controls? These things are things that we tend to do more at the assessment phase. All right, when I am assessing control risk, that very first control risk assessment, I do a lot of inquiry and observation, watching people and asking them. But if I want to gather evidence on whether the control is working correctly, then I do more of these two. Looking at records, looking at documents, reperforming tasks, looking at computer records. So it could be computer information there as well as physical. But we do still have to have professional judgment, all right? This word always comes back in because what I need to do is I need to know which controls to test. Company might have 25 controls. I'm going to select the ones that provide the most efficient and most effective audit evidence. So if I have a control that is about, let's say, occurrence of sales, that makes sure that sales really are real, like let's say the checkout, the self-serve checkout at Woolies, right? When it weighs the basket, you scan the goods, and then it weighs the bag. So there is a control about occurrence of sales, sales of real goods to real people. It covers accuracy because it's got a master price list and barcode scanning. And then it tries to record all of the goods that you've sold by matching the goods scanned to the goods in your basket being weighed. So it does occurrence, accuracy, and a little bit of completeness. That's 3 assertions with 1 test. So that's pretty efficient, rather than do 3 separate tests there. In terms of how much testing of controls is required, there I'm going to refer you to, there's going to be a table that we look at later on that talks about how much. And obviously we know that relates back to ASI 530 and our idea of sampling. But when we are doing testing of internal controls, most of the time we're doing non-statistical testing. All right, non-statistical size calculation. And we're going to talk about later the magic number 25, which is generally the number of items you select to test when you're coming up with that sample. Don't know where 25 comes from, it just seems to be an historical artifact. So how much testing? This is the same sort of stuff that is in ASA 530 in the appendices. All right, so really simple things. You know, if the control is performed more often, we test more. If I want to have more reliance, I do more. If I want to make sure that the control operated throughout the entire period, I might need to collect more evidence. So those things are nothing really new. I also have to consider if there's a person operating a control, if it's a manual control, how good is that person at doing their job? Or from your interview and observation of them, do you get the feeling that they just really have no clue as to what they're doing? I once saw a chartered accountant try and make changes to a company's accounts after those accounts had been audited and submitted to ASIC. I'm like, what are you doing trying to make a journal entry to, and we got a little email warning flag sent through to us as part of a monitoring control saying someone is trying to make a journal entry to a year that has been closed off and submitted to ASIC and the stock exchange. And this guy was a CA. I thought, how on earth did you pass the CA? This is pretty scary stuff. So look at the quality of the person doing the control. Are they well trained? Do they have the right skill set? Think about the control environment. Is there a chance for management to override? Are internal auditors checking up on the work? Do we need to make sure it works throughout the whole period? If there's a change in your computer system throughout the year, then you need to do much more testing. All right, and it'll be a big job. You need to make sure what the system used to do and what the system does now is the same thing. In some instances, you might find that the old way you were doing it has been wrong for many, many, many years. That was the ABC Learning instance. Have you guys heard of ABC Learning? Probably too young, I would imagine. So ABC Learning was a set of childcare centres that were publicly voted on the stock exchange. I think Eddie Groves was the CEO. He'd made lots of money. I don't think he had any formal qualification in early childhood, but he was a businessman that owned all these centres. And they'd been audited by PKF, I think it was, for many, many, many years. And after, I think it was 5 years, they decided they wanted to trade up to a Big Four auditor. Ernst & Young, I think it was. And in the first year, Ernst & Young found an error in their accounting and their accounting policy choices that had existed from the very beginning. And as soon as they restated the accounts, they discovered the company was insolvent. So it can be very serious if you've had a change in accounting system and you didn't realize you're making a mistake for all that time. All right. And then also my prior experience with the client there. So if in the past the client has done a good job at maintaining internal controls, then you might feel more confident in relying on them. All right. How much evidence do I need to gather? I need to gather enough evidence to conclude that the control is effective. I'm going to add a little sentence here. Oh, pardon me. It's really important that it's been effective over the entire financial period. All right? Because when the control, if the control is broken for 1 month of the year, then that's one portion of the year where you could be having misstatements. And this goes back to one of the questions in today's homework, where I think they said they'd lost some accounting staff, and there was some periods during the year where there were issues around invoices and cash collection and complaints from customers. That's an instance where the control was not effective for that period. And in that period, then we may need to consider looking at some substantive testing. All right. I won't get into attribute sampling because we're not going to dig into that too much. So how much testing when I'm testing an application control, like I've got manual follow-up procedures, or I'm testing controls over the program changes, then I might want to look at something like, how do we test to make sure that every time the prices are changed at Woolworths, somebody's approving that, right? So I don't, I suddenly want to buy a whole lot of nappies at Woolworths and I work at Woolies, I just don't go into the master price file for the afternoon, change the price of nappies to like $5 a box, buy a whole lot, come back and change it back. So we need to test that the application controls are working. We might want to benchmark. In terms of computer programs, we do expect computer programs to break down if programs change or they need to be updated. But you might be able to compare that to some industry standards in some way. In terms of timing, when it comes to timing my internal controls, usually you do a lot of interim work with timing because you can test 3/4 of the year. All right, so test 75% of the year. Oh, that's very lightly changed that colour. So that's what you would do with the interim testing. And we test the interim controls, the entity and the controls over applications early, because if I find a weakness in a software application around accounting, that means I need to increase my control risk assessment, decrease my control risk, and shift to a more substantive strategy. So the earlier I can discover whether there are any control weaknesses or control failures, then the quicker I can change my audit strategy, and the more likely it is I meet my deadline. If I don't test these controls until July, I've really only got 6 weeks until the audit is due. And if I found a big error or a big risk, then that might not be enough time to go out and investigate. So here's the table that has the good old number 25. Here, now for these, where it says reasonable assurance, that's when control risk is low. All right, so when control risk is low, I'm going to rely on the controls a lot. However, if control risk is medium, then I'm going to rely on the controls somewhat, but in that instance, I'm also going to be doing a significant amount of substantive testing. All right. So I'm going to be doing both of those things together. Whoops, I want the pen. Okay, so if I'm going to rely less, I collect less, but for most publicly listed companies, this is the box that you're in. They usually have pretty good controls, and if the control happens at least once a day, we're going to collect 25 to 30. Now, from a practical standpoint, if a control is happening quarterly, it doesn't take much extra in that instance to test all 4 than test 2 of something. And then you can be extra sure. Monthly testing 2, weekly testing 5. And this is all here. Let me write this down. Non-statistical sample sizes. All right, and in practice, you would be collecting all of this evidence using haphazard methods. All right, even though random is best and then interval after that, the practical reality is that almost all testing on audits is haphazard, as much as we'd like to be able to get away from it. All right, now this is key, results. So my question for my results is, do the results confirm my preliminary evaluation? All right, so let's say that up here I decided, oops, control risk is low. Okay, so here, if the controls are working correctly, then control risk stays at low, and I only do limited substantive testing there. There I might do, 15 to 25 in my sample, but I will always do some substantive testing. I will never do a controls-only audit. All right? I will always do some substantive testing as a backup process, just to make sure I don't miss anything. All right? That's safe audit practice there. If not, are there any other controls that might do the same job? And then, usually that's unlikely, we revise our control risk assessment. So if control risk now goes up to high, for example, what happens to detection risk? Does detection risk go up or down? If control risk is going up, detection risk goes down. Yep, so detection risk moves down to low. Okay, and then what happens to my audit strategy? Ooh, yeah. What happens to my audit strategy if my detection risk goes down to low? Yes, our audit now needs to move to a substantive approach. Okay. So how do I know whether I need to test extra controls? The first question, and I've mentioned this a few times to you guys, is when I find an issue, I inquire, what's the cause? Is this something that is a one-off, or do I think it might happen again? If I think it might happen again, I'm going to do some other tests. All right? I might test another batch of evidence, or I might look at evidence from other procedures within the audit, because everything is linked together. If I'm gathering evidence on sales, I'm also sort of gathering evidence on accounts receivable at the same time because of that debit and credit. And then I also need to consider if there have been changes in the control environment. So if you've got a new CFO, that might increase or decrease the overall risk. So that one there is not really about sort of tests of controls, but that's really a factor of affecting a change in the control environment. All right, down there. Let's do a save. Okay, documentation. This is really, really crucial because documentation will save your bacon if you go to court. All right, so we have to document. 3 main reasons. Number 1, you win Powerball and you go off to the Bahamas and you leave some other poor auditor on your team to pick up the pieces. They're not going to know what to do unless you've documented your choices. Number 2, you're so engrossed in thinking about an audit issue that you step out into traffic, you get hit by a bus. You're in a coma, somebody else still needs to fill in on the audit for you. Number 3, everything goes well on the audit, and then 3 years later you get sued and someone is saying it's your fault. You need to have that documentation to prove that you've done everything correctly. So you decide in your program or in your documentation, what did you do? Why are you testing that control? What were the results? And if we found any issues, what did we do about them? Did we investigate? Who did we talk to? What did the client say was the issue? The key in terms of how much documentation, sufficient detail to allow another auditor to perform the same test. That is also the standard of detail I expect from students in designing their procedures. All right. When I ask you to design a control test or a substantive test, I'm asking you to design it to the level where somebody else could walk up, read your instructions, and know exactly what to do. Clear, specific instructions. So here's an example. There's a little video actually where I go through some and I talk about all the issues of what all these components are. So that's something you guys can watch online. This is something we already know about. We know about the audit risk model, and we just talked about the risk on testing. So let's look at some practical examples. And out of all the field studies, there were some really awesome ones. Though some of them, certainly people were at their work taking photographs of things that they did. In some instances, when I looked at some of them that were really great, I didn't want you getting in trouble by perhaps me publishing your pictures by using them in the example. So I haven't, some of the ones that were really, really good, I thought just to be safe, and I don't want to jeopardize some people at their jobs, I wouldn't use the images. But is there anybody here, the person that did the Australian Institute of Fitness? No? No, out of the 14 of us, it wasn't one of the people here. But the person worked at the Australian Institute of Fitness, and what we see here, I'm going to blow up this so that you can see it a bit better. All right. It says that stage 1, payment is taken by admin only. And if you look here, what does it say on the actual machine? Manage a password. So you can't just go up and swipe a card on the machine. It looks like that somebody has to have a specific PIN. Okay, so I'm going to ask 2 questions. Number 1, I'll do the first part in blue. What sort of control is this? Is this a manual control or an IT control or both? Both. All right, so this control is manual because of the passcode and IT at the same time, all right? Because the machine has its own controls, yeah? When you swipe a card on the machine, what does it do? Why is it important that this machine is connected to a phone line? It checks to make sure that there are funds available, so it connects to the banking system so that you can't just like make a credit card at home using some technology to imprint on the card and swipe it. So it reads the card, decrypts the information, sends it across the phone line to the financial institution, checks that funds are available, the card's not reported stolen, and then comes back saying, okay, you can go ahead with the transaction. What does the person have to do if you're buying something using one of these machines?
Input their password.
You have to input your password, yep. So there's also plus customer control in the form of the PIN. What was there before the PIN? Signature. Yep, and we moved away from signature because nobody ever checked. And this way, in the old days, you had to have a signature and then a copy, and then you would have to, if you were the merchant, you would have to send the copy of the little credit card slip with the signature to the bank. How many pieces of paper is that? Right? Can you imagine that at Woolies every time someone signs and then at the end of the day they send this big stack of paper to the bank? What the hell does the bank do with it? Are they actually checking these? Are they feeding them into some sort of scanner and then checking them against signatures? So we have a different system now, but it checks the information and then the customer enters their PIN. Now, how would I test that this control is working correctly? What could I do to check that the admin manager thing?
Enter a wrong code.
Yes. So we could try enter an incorrect code. All right. I'll make this a bit smaller because I'm going to run out of space otherwise. All right. So we could enter an incorrect code. I could try, I could get a report of how many admin passwords exist and who they are allocated to. All right. I could review a report of transaction history by password. Because if you thought that perhaps one admin was maybe doing something incorrectly, you might see that in the transactions. Yeah? We could see if, I don't know if the machine will tell you this. Does the machine generate a report of incorrect passcode tries? That could be useful to know. All right. So we've got a range of tests there for our little machine. Now the reason I chose this one, this particular field study, is because it had electronic controls and manual controls as well. So here's a manual one. We have a receipt book. So this looks like a receipt book that's carbon copy. That means that there's the white page, probably a yellow one and a blue one. I'm sure that one of these copies will be a customer copy. Does it say? It doesn't say. But I'm guessing that one of these will be a customer copy, one of these will be a copy that stays in the book, and then one is a copy we might send off to do for accounting. I'm not sure. Can anybody notice anything in the book that could be an internal control? Yes, this little number here. All right, that's a pre-printed number in the receipt book. That means that each receipt is uniquely numbered. We can't have duplicates. So the receipt before this is 3302. The receipt after this is 3304. Can anyone tell me what assertion that pre-numbering seeks to help us with? Completeness. Who said completeness? Sijun. Thank you for that. So Sijun said completeness, and that's really important to make sure that if I know the first transaction and the last transaction, I can look through the book to see if any number in the sequence is missing. So this one, very clearly, manual control. All right, this receipt book. But let's look at how we might test it. If I'm testing completeness, I could select a block sample of receipts or a single book and check each number in the sequence is present. Okay. What else might we do? We know that there is on here, there's no control about the course, the quantity, the cost, or the total. Right? You just write whatever you like in there. So if we wanted to check that this manual control is working correctly, we could do something like vouch a sample of sales journals to receipts and ensure total is correctly calculated. And here we're actually doing a bit of a control test and a substantive test at the same time. All right, and there's no approval anywhere there. There's like a box that says goods collected, tick. But they do say here at the end of each day there's a reconciliation where the receipt book is looked over. They add the student purchases to a rundown of payments, compare it to the FPOS terminal, and then they staple the FPOS receipt to the receipt book page. So I might even look for, has each of these receipts either got a cash transaction or the credit card slip? And then it says here there's some sort of little reconciliation thing. I might look to see that daily reconciliation and reperform some of them. So I'll add that to this here. Reperform, whoops, I can't spell, perform a sample of the daily reconciliations. All right, to make sure that that's being done. How are we doing? Is everyone still with me? All right. Is this a bit easier now that last week you went out and you actually looked at actual controls rather than looking at control descriptions in textbooks? Hopefully the field study helped, because that was the whole point of it. Here's the last one. This is onto the computer system. To log in, enter your email address and password in the form below. All right, so what sort of control have we got here? IT, that's a pretty easy one. All right, so we've clearly got an IT control, but now, how would I test that this control works? Try an incorrect password. All right. I could try an email address for a staff member. Let's change this. It's not very good wording. For someone who no longer works at the company. All right, because you want to make sure that when people get fired, they still don't have access to your systems by logging on. I could evaluate how often passwords are changed. UTS has a system where every, I think it's 90 days, I automatically get prompted to change my password, and I can't go with any of my last 5 passwords. It actually stores them in a system, which gets really tricky when you've been working here for 13 years. Luckily, it doesn't do the whole history. I could even do a bit of an analytical procedure. Compare how many email addresses exist versus number of employees. Now, this is, of course, assuming that only employees have access to this email system. Exception report. View any exception reports for email addresses that have had multiple incorrect password attempts. That could give me an idea of people who might have been hacked, or someone who's trying to hack in. I do wonder at UNSW whether that was somebody leaked their password, told a friend their password. Was it like a phishing expedition that they managed to go on, or was it like one of those brute force, they just kept trialing passwords? I'd be interested if it ever comes out to find out how that happened. Any questions? Everyone's okay? We're all right? So after today, we looked at the types of controls, the techniques, but the key thing for you guys to remember and to work on is that designing, creating, making part. That's going to be the key moving forward. I know that this is not accessible in the midterm exam, so everyone's a bit tired and is a bit over it at this point. But just keep persevering because next week is our last week before the break. Got a 2-week break, which I will be away, but Nelson will be available. And then when we come back, it's only weeks 10, 11, 12, 13. So, and it's only 3 new topics when we come back. So we'll have only a very small short period of time before we get to the final exam. So if you can keep up to date at least a little bit, then that'll be much easier towards the end. And we finished early. Thank you everybody tonight. Thank you to the 14 people. Hopefully we'll get the same 14 here next week for our last week before the break.